How did she turn into this woman who would, by her own hands, do things that are hardly fit to tell?
These are the stories of terrible deeds.
She was probably the most unique female serial killer that I came across.
Of crimes written in blood on history's pages.
Seasoned firemen fell to their knees from the stench of death inside the room.
Across time and across continents, something united these murderers.
I think Dr. Hazard was a serial killer, and a sadistic one at that.
Apparently that's where she performed autopsies, in that bathtub.
Something more than wicked determination.
She was one of the worst killers of all time. It was possible for her to get away with anything.
Something more than menacing minds.
This is almost a museum of death of her own design.
The answer lies behind the masks of deadly women.
Those stories tell us who we are as people and what our dark side is. My grandfather made veiled references to an evil person who had been in the family. The family did not want to talk about Elizabeth. They just knew this was a bad person.
Dennis Bathory Kitts is a haunted man. The comfort of his home in Vermont can't shelter him from the horrors performed in his family name more than 400 years ago.
I struggle with what the Countess did all the time, in part because I've built a website about the Countess and I get a lot of very, very hostile email. And I begin to realize how much this has cascaded down through the centuries.
Countess Elizabeth Bathory was a Hungarian noblewoman at the turn of the 17th century.
She was cousin to the king of Hungary, of Transylvania, considered the most beautiful woman in the realm. Educated, brilliant, trilingual, a woman whose castles formed a line between west and east.
A diplomat, the Countess negotiated treaties between these two great empires. But by night, another creature emerged. The Countess of Blood.
There is evidence that hundreds of servants went to that castle and never came back.
It's believed Elizabeth was one of the world's worst serial killers, murdering perhaps 600 of her servants.
The numbers are astounding until you do the math. And if you think of the fact that she lived into her 50s and probably began this as a teenager, so she had 40 years to kill 600 of her servants.
Let's say, for the sake of argument, that she only killed 10% of what she's rumored to have killed.
In all her career, FBI profiler Candice DeLong has never encountered murder on such a scale.
60. And that would still make her one of the most prolific serial killers in the history of the world.
Elizabeth's personal death toll dwarfs any in modern crime. Even more disturbing is why she murdered.
There is a tale that this began because the blood fell on her skin when she was hitting a servant, and she thought that it made that skin younger.
Elizabeth believed blood would preserve her youth and beauty. In a macabre prologue to the fictitious Count Dracula from nearby Transylvania, the Countess drank her victim's blood. But unlike Dracula, Elizabeth was cruel fact.
Vampirism is a clinical term used by psychiatrists throughout the world. It is a behavior of consuming blood.
For criminal profiler Candice DeLong, this bizarre ritual is not unique to the environs of Transylvania.
I'm aware of cases in the United States, one very recent and one 30 years old, in which the individuals, both males, killed people for the sole purpose of consuming their blood.
Perhaps it was wanting some sort of youth from these young people. Perhaps it was just some sort of a mental defect that did not translate to the rest of her life.
Dennis is consumed by his ancestor. He gives blood as symbolic compensation and is driven to unearth the reasons for Elizabeth's evil.
How did she turn into this woman who would, by her own hands, do things that are hardly fit to tell? What can you say about this kind of behavior?
Modern science may have an answer to Dennis's painful question.
You see, before women began taking iron replacement therapy, they would lose iron each month with their menstrual period. And so many women were iron deficient. And when you're iron deficient, your hemoglobin level drops.
Forensic pathologist and county coroner Dr. Janice Amatuzio knows the human body's secrets. For 20 years, she's examined the dead, bringing their stories to life.
Blood is a real phenomenal source of iron. Perhaps she thought it would make her look more vibrant or younger because perhaps she was iron deficient. By drinking this blood, she got a rosy glow to her cheeks because she finally got her hemoglobin up to the level it was at.
Was the Blood Countess self-medicating for anemia? It's something Dennis had never considered. But he thinks there must be more behind the terrible crimes of his ancestor.
She bit her victims. She would bite their flesh.
What could turn a noblewoman into a vampire?
Those stories tell us who we are as people and what our dark side is.
Dennis is determined to find out. The dark side of human nature also fascinated Michael Kelleher until he learned too much.
I've spent so many years dealing with so many violent people that I want my later years to be part of the natural process of what it is to be human.
The author and former profiler now searches for peace.
And that involves nature. It doesn't lie. It doesn't manipulate. It accepts everything. And it's part of who we are.
While working on his book, Murder Most Rare, Michael came as close as he dared to a host of deadly women.
My original interest in female serial killers came from the misguided perception in the United States that there weren't any, or that there was at most one, which to me seemed inconceivable. So found nearly 100 since 1900, both in the United States and out, and stopped at that number.
The killer intriguing him most is Vera Renzi.
She was probably the most unique female serial killer that I came across. She was clearly intelligent. She had resources. She murdered in her own home. She controlled the environment in which she killed for years and years. The daughter of a very well-to-do family. a pretty girl, but a wild girl who wound up being, well, I don't know how to put this delicately, one heck of an efficient serial killer.
In the 1930s, in Bucharest, Hungary, Vera Renzi murdered her lovers. Each and every one of them. After 2 failed marriages, the beautiful Vera invited a long line of suitors.
She allures, she draws this male in. And this wouldn't be happenstance. This male would be selected by her. And she would use her allure, her tacit beauty, her money, her sophistication to draw him in a sexual way.
Vera chose married men.
This would be his last night on earth. His dinner would be well seasoned with something not to his liking that would kill him.
Vera's seductive dinners were laced with arsenic.
Arsenic is a popular method of poisoning that we've seen throughout the centuries.
What will happen? The individuals who take it, first of all, will begin to feel sick. Arsenic causes a disruption of the membranes of the stomach, something called hemorrhagic, meaning blood-filled, gastritis, meaning inflammation. So they'll get a stomach ache.
I would imagine that she would only let him know at the very end when he began to suffer intensely from the poison. She would be conveying to him that he would never leave her, ever.
But Vera's plans don't end with death.
She had a propensity for preserving her murdered males in zinc coffins in her basement.
The symbolism of trophies for serial killers is maybe something to brag about their event, even though they may not brag about it to another person. For them, they say, I've got this.
Vera collected morbid souvenirs.
A souvenir is something that a killer might keep to bring back good feelings of the individual, good feelings of the event, and something that's more personal.
For today's criminal investigators, there's an explanation for such bizarre behavior.
They want to hold on to that piece, that connection, and so people will try to hold on to bodies.
But without preservation, Vera's mementos would soon decompose.
Within 20 minutes of the time of death, our bodies begin to break down. The bacteria that are in our intestines, within 20 minutes, travel outside of our intestines and do what they do best. They start digesting things.
Vera had thought of everything.
Well, zinc, at least at the time that these crimes were committed, was probably the most expensive, the most long-lasting form of casket she could purchase. Embalming would be out of the question because it would let her secret out.
An airtight zinc casket and Vera's damp basement may have provided the ideal conditions for a type of mummification.
Adipose sear formation, where the fats in the body complex with the salts, calcium, sodium, in water or in moist soil and form a soap-like or waxy consistency. Then the bodies will be preserved and eventually become hardened, almost stone-like.
This is almost a museum of death of her own design. Her victims are here, they're in her control.
Anytime she wanted to go talk with them and interact with them, she could. This would, for a while, serve a purpose and meet a need that she had. Eventually, it would cease to do so, and I think that's probably when she would go out and get another victim.
What drove Vera Renzi to such a macabre ritual? Modern analysis suggests she was simply looking for love.
Her first husband allegedly cheated on her, and this infuriated her. She had a terrible fear of rejection from males.
Vera set a course for revenge, but in a way that preserved the adoration of the men who followed.
Everybody wants to be loved, and once you have it, you always want to have it. But many of us lose it. We lose things that we love, as well as people that we love, and we usually go on. We'll mourn the loss or grieve or move on to something else to replace it. We don't kill.
Vera replaced love from the living with love from the dead. She killed for more than a decade until a suspicious wife called police to Vera's basement. They found 35 zinc coffins. Among the preserved victims, her 2 missing husbands. She lived 400 years ago, but the Countess's murderous motives still elude Dennis Bathory Kitts. His ancestor inhabits both his rational and creative mind. He's composing an opera about her.
I am the Countess Bathory, the Countess. I am the Countess.
This particular scene takes place when Elizabeth, the Blood Countess, has called a singer in the local church to her castle to sing for her. And the Countess keeps asking her, sing to me, sing to me, sing to me.
Through music, Dennis brings Elizabeth back to life, hoping to find meaning behind her malevolence. Over time, the Countess's behavior became more extreme as she yearned for youth and eternal beauty.
She would not only drain this blood to drink, but she would drain the blood and bathe in it and cover herself in it and luxuriate in a bath of warm blood.
For this, she needed even more victims.
There are 5 liters of blood in an adult human being. It takes only the loss of 1 liter, or 20% of the circulating blood volume, for the body to decompensate. In other words, for it to go into shock. Death death would occur because simply there wouldn't be enough blood to go to the brain. And secondly, their heart would go into ventricular fibrillation or another abnormal heart rhythm. And then subsequently stop and respirations would stop.
We have to hear the story of Elizabeth because it reminds us that there are things we have to attend to, things that we have to prevent from ever happening again.
Dennis decides that to finish his work and to truly understand his murderous namesake, he must go to the scene of her crimes. "200 years after Elizabeth's reign, another deadly woman would become legend in the French Quarter of New Orleans.
The incident had such an impact on the city that for many years, many people wouldn't walk on the same side of the street as the house. Others avoided the block completely.
Amateur historian and tour guide Kalila Smith makes a regular stop at 1140 Royal Street.
The door was bolted and locked from the outside. They could hear screams and cries coming from within.
The fortunate ones were dead.
It was here in 1834 what's believed to be the city's most horrendous crime was discovered.
I think that the history in New Orleans is far more bizarre than anything any fictional writer could possibly come up with.
Madame Delphine LaLaurie was an A-list socialite with money and connections.
Her husband was a surgeon, a very prominent surgeon in the city, and she was from a very wealthy French family. They were best known in the city for their lavish cocktail parties that they would throw, entertaining the upper echelon in the city, and they threw them quite frequently.
But Madame LaLaurie was not all she seemed.
As she was preparing for one of her cocktail parties, she was being attended to by a little 12-year-old slave girl by the name of Leah. Leah accidentally pulled a madame's hair as she was combing it. And in a fit of rage, Madame LaLaurie pulled out a bullwhip and proceeded to beat this little girl.
Trying to flee the beating, the little girl plunged to her death in the courtyard below.
Madame LaLaurie was brought before the courts for the death of this child. But because she was so influential, because she was rubbing elbows with all the upper echelon, she was given a mere slap on the wrist, a mere $300 fine.
Madame LaLaurie's notoriety would have ended there if it wasn't for a fire soon after. The story is still talked about by firemen today.
Well, that night, the alarm came in for our house, and when the firemen got there, they found a fire in the kitchen, and the slave told the firemen to go up to the third floor of the house and check it out.
The door was bolted and locked from the outside, yet they could hear screams and cries from within. Seasoned firemen who had obviously had experience with death before literally fell to their knees vomiting from the stench of death inside the room.
The firemen found a house of horror. It took a house fire to lay bare Madame LaLaurie, the New Orleans socialite, as a serial killer.
Upon entering one of the apartments, the most appalling spectacle met their eyes.
Corpses, people, slaves that were chained to the wall.
7 slaves, more or less horribly mutilated, were seen suspended by the neck, with their limbs apparently stretched and torn from one extremity to the other.
They found some that were buried under the flooring, mutilated bodies that were cut up.
Language is powerless and inadequate to give a proper conception of the horror which is a scene like this must have inspired.
It was just a real tragedy up there that they found.
That Madame LaLaurie had blood on her hands seems beyond doubt. Her motivation is less clear. One theory suggests Madame LaLaurie and her doctor husband were doing their own scientific research.
Well, people used to dig up graves and dissect bodies. This wasn't usually something done for a bizarre sacrifice. This was done out of human curiosity.
In the 1830s, knowledge of anatomy was limited. A curious but warped mind might see powerless slaves as lab rats.
And back then, we didn't even know precisely how blood circulated and how the body worked. It was fascinating.
That might have been the excuse, a quest for medical knowledge, but to be performing it on live people? No, it goes way beyond that.
The scant surviving evidence also points to another motivation.
The only word that comes to mind is a sadist. A sadist derives pleasure from inflicting pain on another individual. The pain can be physical or emotional or sexual, but the sadist delivers pleasure.
And still, there's another possibility.
The truth of the matter is that no matter how cruel her behavior, it might have been aimed at trying to solve a crime.
Lester Sullivan, archivist at Xavier University of Louisiana, thinks Madame LaLaurie might have been conducting her own cruel criminal investigation.
Shortly before the mansion caught on fire, there had been a rebellion on one of the plantations her family owned, downriver in St. Bernard Parish, in which her own mother was killed. Obviously, if she's got people chained and she's interrogating them under duress, probably involving torture and such. I mean, it takes a certain kind of ruthlessness to take this kind of action, to take the law into one's own hands.
It was some sort of distorted, displaced anger for some reason that she would go to such extremes to mutilate people the way she did.
Sadist, scientist, or avenger? We may never know.
Somehow the LaLaurie's escaped. Now, it's a mystery what happened to them. Many people believe that they wound up going down to the river and jumping ship. Some people say they even went back to Paris.
Whatever Madame LaLaurie's motivation, one thing more than anything else made her secret slayings possible: power. In the hands of deadly women, it's a lethal weapon. As the sick and gullible discovered in Washington State.
Linda Hazard was a leader. She was a speech maker. She commanded attention wherever she went. I mean, if she was somebody today, she'd be a household name. She'd be a superstar today. Dr. Hazard. I mean, it is the perfect name for a woman who perpetrates this type of crime. A doctor named Hazard. I mean, it's perfect.
When crime writer Greg Olson moved to Olalla, Washington, he found the perfect subject.
Turn of the century medicine, quackery, greed, everything that you would ever imagine that you think is contemporary to today was going on back then, of course. And it happened here in Nowheresville.
In 1911, the sick and the wealthy were lured to these backwaters from Europe and the US on a promise. They came to cure their ills. Two wealthy sisters, Claire and Dora Williamson from England, were typical of Dr. Hazard's patients.
Is everything suitable?
Yes, thank you.
The girls, they came, they thought this was going to be a holiday in the country. They were excited about going. They couldn't wait to get to Olalla. They had no idea what was in store for them.
For an upfront fee of $100 a week, the sisters would receive only a starvation diet and a place to die.
The diet that she developed was very strenuous. I mean, it was limited to 2 8-ounce glasses of a broth a day. Either a tomato or an asparagus broth was what she gave her patients.
Very good. Well done. As a rule, fasting has been known throughout the centuries as a way to purify one's body and therefore purify one's mind. There is no medical benefit to starving. Starvation causes death.
Common sense should have warned patients off the treatment within days, but Dr. Hazard's power usually prevailed.
The power of her mind and the power of her conviction was intoxicating for people. I mean, people would listen to her, and you could not help but believe what she was saying.
The sisters, like many others, persevered.
After we have gotten over the first day or two, maybe even 3, we are no longer going to feel hunger. We're going to at first feel a bit alert when we're starting to burn all the fats. But as we get through the fat and start burning off the protein, we're going to begin to get listless.
I think Dr. Linda Hazard was a serial killer, and a sadistic one at that. You don't even have to be a doctor to know if somebody is only fed diluted tomato juice on a daily basis that they eventually will die. She knew this, and she continued on with her experiment.
Dr. Linda Hazard's dietary experiments are remembered to this day.
I didn't know what a concentration camp was till after World War II, and then I saw pictures of it, and that's what those people looked like.
As a little girl, 80-year-old Lucienne Pendarvis had some frightening visitors. Escapees from the Hazard Clinic.
My mother used to feed them. Because they had to go right by her door, and she couldn't stand it. She would give them something to eat. They were just skin and bone, and their clothes just hung on them. Their eyes were sunk in, and they used to, we have what's called huckleberries here, and they would just strip those in the fall. Any kind of berry there was out there, they were eating it.
First, our immune systems are going to start to malfunction. And along with that, we're going to have this profound weakness. And then, eventually, we're not going to be able to maintain our blood pressure.
They grew weaker and weaker, but each time that they would complain about it or ask about it, Dr. Hazard would tell them, the cure is imminent, just a few more days. Hang on just a bit longer, and you'll have perfect, robust health. It'll just come in an instant.
Fortunately, the Pendarvis family didn't succumb to Dr. Hazard's spell.
And she also used to come down to the house because my dad had ulcers and he was sick, and she was going to cure him. But my mother and father had no part of what she was doing.
Claire and Dora Williamson consumed only broth for 2 whole months. Dr. Hazard's allure was finally overtaken by the will to live.
Claire knew this is my last chance. If I don't get out of here, I'm gonna die. And if I die, my sister's going to die. So Claire, somehow, we don't know how she even had the strength, somehow she crawled out of that attic and got out there to the woods and made it halfway down the hill before she realized she could go no further.
Feeble and disoriented, Claire's escape was short-lived.
Claire!
But when she heard Dr. Hazard's voice, it just like a spell, something came over her and she realized, I can't fight this. Unfortunately for Claire, there'd be no saving her. There was no end to Dr. Hazard's, really, her skill, if you want to call it, or her evil. I mean, not only did she treat these patients as their physician, she also acted as a coroner and did the post-mortem examinations on each one of her patients.
Dr. Hazard's failures were never registered. To the medical world, her victims died of various diseases.
The fact that the patient weighed less than 50 pounds was never on the certificate. It was always cirrhosis of the liver or something like that would be listed as the cause of death.
Today, the Doctor's House of Cruelty still stands. Its secrets not altogether lost.
You know, in this house, right here in this very spot, she was involved in actually cooking or preparing something. And so it's a strange feeling knowing that you're part of history living here in this house. The original bathtub is in there, and so apparently that's where she performed autopsies, in that bathtub.
The Jones family think they may be sharing this place with Dr. Hazard's victims.
It's funny, sometimes if you're standing here washing dishes and it just out of the corner of your eye, it's like there's a face just right there in the corner of the window. And so you'll look up and there's nobody there. It's eerie. There's always somebody here in the house with you, even if the house is empty and it's just you.
But Claire Williamson's death was a turning point in Dr. Hazard's career. Although there's no record of how, Dora managed to get a message out and was rescued. Dr. Hazard was convicted of manslaughter and jailed for 18 months. But she would be back.
This is what's sort of outrageous, really. She leaves town and then she comes back. And the local people who knew all about this just sort of looked the other way.
Within 8 years, Dr. Hazard had renewed her practice. Her starvation diet again on the menu. There were more deaths.
The number is somewhere between 20 and 40 people, and we think some of them were disposed of here in this ravine. It's very deep. It's about probably a 100-foot drop from the house down. And, wild animals, bears, all sorts of things have been out here. Cougars, we have a lot of wildlife out here. So it's very possible if somebody was dumped down there that the body was dragged away.
The killing only stopped when the doctor herself became ill.
Well, this is kind of sweet, really, in the end. Linda Hazard got pneumonia, and she told the world, I'm going to cure myself by using the fast.
Justice came at her own hand.
And she fasted for, I think, 25 days before she basically killed herself and died by her own treatment. I think she had something to prove. I believe she did everything for the cure, that she really believed that by bringing this to people, that she was going to change the way we deal with medicine.
For criminal profiler Candace DeLong, It was delusion that killed Linda Hazard and her patients.
A delusion is a strong belief in something, an idea, a concept that has no basis in fact, and the person believes it despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
Could delusion also explain the crimes of Countess Bathory?
The victims are supposed to be buried around here.
Her descendant, Dennis Bathory Kitts, has traveled to Slovakia, to Chuktica Castle, looking for clues.
It is an incredible spot. It is unbelievable, kind of frightening place. And there is the rumor that in the dark side of that wall, where the forest grows down quickly into the valley, that the servant girls were dumped.
The Countess's quest for blood to keep her young was as powerful as it was perverse. Was it a simple iron deficiency or grotesque delusion?
The kind of woman who brutally murders for blood, to my way of thinking, is probably delusional or psychotic.
Dennis's ancestor lived in violent times when war and torture were the norm, when power was absolute.
Someone who is severely mentally ill and suffering from a delusion, it's probably going to be noticed or noticeable to those around them. Except we're going back 500 years to a woman who was very wealthy and was a countess, and oftentimes at those higher levels, mental illness and strange behavior is ignored.
Ignored and isolated. The Blood Countess lived beyond reproach by the townspeople below. Peasant servants could be killed without repercussion.
It was possible for her to get away with anything here because the only people around were her trusted servants, other royalty, and those who would never speak again, the girls.
Countess Bathory was locked in a deadly cycle of delusion, with nothing and no one to bring her back to reality.
And oftentimes, the more a person tries to get that thought out of their mind or that feeling out of their heart, the less they're able to do so. And oftentimes, the more the individual thinks about it, it kind of develops a life of its own. It feeds on itself.
Although many generations separate Dennis from his ancestor, he feels obliged to redress the crime.
There comes a time when the people who perpetrated the evil have to say, even if it's generations down the line, we're sorry for having done this to you.
Dennis is about to visit the small town of Chuktica, from where many of the Countess's victims came. He has no idea what sort of reception he'll receive. Many in Chuktica claim a family connection to the life and crimes of the Blood Countess. Dennis has invited 20 of the town's dignitaries, including the mayor, to an appropriate venue, Pizzeria Bathory.
This is a reconciliation meal today to reconcile the Bathory family with the people of Chuktica.
What will they make of this thoughtful American following his obsession to the other side of the world?
Dobrý den, pani Ištoková.
The moment arrives for Dennis to make his peace.
Dnes na sobě nemám nic cenného, tedy barvu noci. I said, first of all, that I wasn't wearing black, which is the color of night, and I wasn't wearing red, which was the color of blood, but instead I was wearing violet, which was the color of healing. Fialovu, And I said that it was time for a healing between the family of all the Bathorys, which I was representing today, and the people of Chaktitsa for the deeds that were done 400 years ago by the Countess. And I hoped with the gift of friendship, it would be better both today and in the future.
And I would like to thank you for all you've done. And you are welcome anytime here. And they're not angry with you anymore. You are our friends. You are not our enemies.
Elizabeth Bathory, Vera Renzi, Delphine LaLaurie, and Linda Hazard, all in the grip of a human failing, seated tragically in youth.
We know from studying killers that oftentimes the fantasies that they have, that they end up acting out in their murder, is a fantasy that they started having in their early teens. Vera Renzi, perhaps her father left her. Perhaps she was abandoned by both parents. But whatever it was, it left a very, very serious scar on her psyche. Research conducted by the FBI into serial killers and sadists revealed that the vast majority of them come from families in which they were mistreated as children. And oftentimes these children are abused. Or they act out the obsession because they believe or they feel they will feel better and it will be over with once they do this. And for a while they do feel better after they commit the act, but the feeling doesn't last. The act never lives up to their fantasy. Why? Because a fantasy's in your mind and you can control every aspect of it. Reality is much different.
Dennis Bathory Kitts has one last appointment to keep. To confront the Blood Countess face to face.
I think this painting is absolutely frightening. The eyes, the pose, the stillness, and when you know what happened behind that stillness, it's even more terrifying.
Elizabeth never cheated age nor death. After murdering a noblewoman, her bloody history was exposed. She was walled into her castle tower. The only mercy, food pushed through a slot. She died alone and old. Her obsession unrealized.
Power, search for youth, madness. It's so impossible to know what it is that drove her to do this.